Hello, myself Pallav. There are some scholars whose work reminds us that history is not only a matter of chronicles and dates, but of the deeper textures of culture, of the ideals, values, and imaginations that shape how societies understand themselves and others. For more than 4 decades, Professor André Wink has been one of the foremost historians to illuminate this terrain, showing us how power, religion, and culture are woven together across the vast expanse of Asia. A distinguished historian of Islamic and Indian history, Professor Wing's scholarship has profoundly reshaped our understanding of the medieval and early modern world. His monumental trilogy, Al-Hind, The Making of the Indo-Islamic World, remains one of the most ambitious works of global history, tracing the long and complex interactions between Islam and the Indian subcontinent and situating these within the wider histories of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. In these volumes, he reminds us that no culture exists in isolation, that conquest, trade, migration, and exchange continually redraw the maps of identity and memory. Professor Wing's writings move seamlessly across empires and centuries, bringing into conversation the histories of the Mughals, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the countless polities that made up the Indian Ocean world. His scholarship unsettles narrow boundaries, instead presenting history as a dynamic interplay of faith, power, and imagination. Whether he is discussing the role of nomadic traditions in shaping empires, the cultural logic of conquest, or the enduring legacy of Indo-Islamic civilization, his work consistently broadens the horizons of world history. Today, he brings to us yet another profound theme, the culture of chivalry. Uh,
Okay, thank
in
you.
the hello, okay, in this lecture, Professor Wing turns our attention to the ideals of honor, loyalty, and martial ethics that transcend borders, binding together warriors and rulers across diverse societies. He asks us to consider how chivalric codes were not only modes of conduct but also powerful cultural expressions shaping diplomacy, literature, kingship, and everyday life in ways that continue to echo across history. Beyond his books and essays, Professor Wink has also shaped the very practice of global and comparative history. His intellectual rigor, vast erudition, and ability to weave together seemingly distant histories have inspired generations of scholars and students around the world. To read his work is to witness the discipline of history at its most expansive, restless, comparative, and deeply human. On behalf of the voices from the periphery, it is a profound honor to welcome Professor Andrew Wing. His presence today reminds us that history is not only about what happened, but about the values and ideals that gave meaning to those events. And in reflecting on the culture of chivalry, he invites us to see how memory, honor, and imagination continue to shape the ways we understand power, community, and ourselves. Professor, up to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Can you still hear me well? Hello? Can you still hear me well?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, this will, as you said rightly, this will be a lecture on what I call the culture of chivalry. Now, if you ask somebody today what chivalry means, um, the answer will probably be that it has something to do with politeness and courtesy. And this is true, but historically it's more complicated. Um, Chivalry is also a military culture. And of course, the military is not about politeness. So it's a more complex phenomenon than what people today generally understand it to be. The word chivalry comes from a old French verb, chevalerie, which means horse soldiery. In other words, chivalry is a characteristic of societies which have a horse riding elite or a horse riding nobility or aristocracy. There are other words that can be used as synonyms in other languages. If you know about the Portuguese sources on India, for example, you probably are aware that the Portuguese have a word for chivalry as well, which is cavalleirosa. And there are various words in Indian and also Indo-Persian, Indian language of Persian and so on, that have sort of the same semantic range. The Persian Jawan Mardi, for instance, is often taken to be a synonym of chivalry. I don't want to go into that, but I'll just use the word chivalry, which is a common word in English even today. From the beginning, people have been writing about chivalry for a long time, and it has never been, I think, the purpose of any European historian to suggest that chivalry is a European phenomenon only. It certainly is a European phenomenon in the Middle Ages, no question. And the French historian Georges Duby, I have a little book here which is in English by Georges Duby called The Chivalrous Society. This may be a bit misleading if you understand that to mean that there's only one chivalrous society, namely the French. The French certainly had a chivalrous society in the Middle Ages, but I don't think Georges Duby wants to say that it is the only one or the most remarkable one even. People have always known in Europe and elsewhere that chivalry was in fact informal code of culture usually, and that it has existed around the world from ancient times and medieval times onwards. That all these different cultures of chivalry in different parts of the world indeed had a lot in common, even though they also were in some respects always unique in their particulars. The European scholars who studied chivalry and medieval society have, for example, always known and emphasized that the European culture of chivalry was indebted in many ways to the Muslim cultures, I should say, of Al-Andalus, that is to say, Spain. There has always been an awareness that there was a kind of influence from medieval Spain on the rest of Europe and the other way around as well. And in England in the 13th century, there are many chivalric orders that have clear references to the Mongols, for example. In the 13th century, the Mongols were actually, well, of course, influential in this sense in England even. So we could talk about all these cultures, but of course that's going to be impossible. And today I will only talk about one of them, which is to say Mughal India. In other words, the 16th and 17th centuries by and large. And I would like to talk a little bit about, if I have the time, which probably won't be the case, about Java, the Indo-Islamic state of Mataram, also 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, which is another very important chivalric culture in what I call the Indo-Islamic world. And we know a fair amount about it, especially from also from Dutch sources, but there's also a lot of Japanese sources. So the source for this talk is actually, well, you said that I have written a trilogy, which is strictly speaking no longer a trilogy, because I have now produced 2 more volumes in this series, namely Al-Hind. Volume 4 has appeared in the last year, and volume 4 consists of 2 parts. You know, there's 2 volumes in volume 4, so there are now 5 volumes of Al-Hind. This is the 4th volume, part 1, and this is the 4th volume, part 2. Today about chivalry is in the 4th volume, part 1, most of it. But there's also quite a bit of material in Al-Hind volume 2, which is about the 13th, the 11th and 12th and 13th centuries. I also wrote it in I wrote about chivalry in a book about Akbar, which was published, I think, 2008. So all these different writings you can refer to if you want to know more about what I think about chivalry today. I should also add that this is actually not only a very interesting subject, but also a subject that needs to be studied more. It's my opinion that someone could easily write an entire book about it, or even a multi-volume book, because there's a lot of material on chivalry in India in the 17th and 16th centuries, and also in other centuries. One of the theses that I'd like to advance is this, which is that it's my opinion that in South Asia, the culture of chivalry lasted much longer than in Europe. Because in India, you have a horse warrior empire that continues until the 18th century. So here I find myself at odds with an earlier body of writing, which tried to show that the Mughal Empire was in fact a gunpowder empire. This idea that the Mughal Empire, as well as the Ottoman Empire, and to some extent the Persian Empire of the Safavids, that these were gunpowder empires, and that this is what made them different from medieval, strictly speaking, medieval empires, I think is entirely wrong. It has been around, however, for a very long time, and you may be aware of the work of Marshall Hodgson, who wrote a 3-volume work on the adventure of Islam, where he advances this idea in elaborate form, and others have done the same. And the Russian historian Barthold was among the earliest people to advance this idea that Mughal India was a gunpowder empire. As I said, I don't believe that, and I am not the only one. The general tendency today among military historians is not to regard the Mughal Empire as a gunpowder empire. That doesn't mean that gunpowder didn't play a role, or even an important role, but what we are trying to suggest is that it did not fundamentally change the mode of organization of the Mughal Empire. In my opinion, and as I said, there are quite a few other historians who share that view. In my opinion, the Mughal Empire remained a horse warrior empire, and it retained a culture of chivalry until colonial times. There's still elements of chivalry in modern culture, of course, but strictly speaking, it is no longer a culture of chivalry what we are looking at today. So Mughal India, in my opinion, was a horse warrior empire, and the culture of that empire, the political culture, also the military culture, was in fact a culture of chivalry. That is why I think it's interesting and important. And it also actually spread further downward, for example, from an elite level chivalry to a somewhat lower levels of society, if you may call them that. The use of horses spread even in the 18th century in India further than it did before. But the culture of chivalry not only lasted longer in India and South Asia, in the Mughal Empire and also elsewhere, but it also became more diffused throughout the population. So, for example, in the 18th century, the Marathas adopted elements of chivalry that they did not really have before. This is, for example, the case. When the Marathas rise and expand all over India, they adopt to some extent a culture of chivalry from Mughal predecessors, in particular the Rajputs. They even make themselves into Rajputs. So the culture of chivalry is not diminishing like it is in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, when you get infantry armies and also artillery and gunpowder weapons replacing horse nobilities. But this is one thing that I think is very important. Now let's go back to the beginning of the Mughal Empire, and that is to say the 16th century. Babur, whom we now call the first of the great Mughals, Babur brought really the Timurid heritage of chivalry to Hindustan. And from then on, it becomes the dominant culture in what we call Mughal India. It's very interesting to see how this Timurid heritage of chivalry originated and developed. We can trace its roots to the Eurasian steppes, to the early Turks and Mongols. In other words, we can trace it to Genghis Khan and Timur. But the Timurid culture that Babur brought to northern India differed already very widely from the earlier forms of nomadic Turco-Mongol chivalry that existed in the Eurasian steppes. I would like to suggest that we call the early form of Turco-Mongol chivalry a form of barbaric chivalry. The term barbaric chivalry may strike you as an oxymoron, but I don't think it should be. In fact, if you're familiar with the early British writer James Todd, he already uses this terminology, barbaric chivalry, and I think that it is useful because the later Timurid culture is much more refined than the culture of the early Mongols, which in our eyes is still quite barbaric. What do I mean by barbaric? Nothing particularly unusual or shocking or denigrating. You can read about the barbaric chivalry of the early Turco-Mongols in all the works on Mongol history. But in Babur's time, and also in the time of Aurangzeb, or rather Alamgir, when after he became emperor in the second half of the 17th century, when he became emperor, there was an Uzbek embassy that reached Delhi and stayed for 4 months. And you can here see how medieval Mongols more or less used to live. Those Uzbeks of the time of Alamgir were very similar to the medieval Mongols. That's at least the idea I'd like to advance. So there had been a great evolution from the 13th century to the 17th century among the Timurids, who developed a much more refined and urban form of chivalry in comparison with the Uzbeks who had stayed behind in Central Asia and were still nomadic and still practiced a way of life that was rather rough by comparison to what is observed in Mughal India. This is, of course, the impression you get if you read, for example, the account of this Uzbek embassy in Delhi, written by the Italian self-proclaimed Dr. Manucci. He describes the habits as of the Uzbeks as quite rustic and uncouth. These people would drink the blood of their horses while they're on campaign. And altogether were considered quite uncivilized in the time of Alamgir. So a great gap had opened up between the Mughals, in fact already in the 16th century, and for example, the Uzbeks who were still in the stage of nomadic culture. You see a kind of a process of civilization that occurred between the 13th and 16th centuries among these nomadic people, or post-nomadic people, we can say. A process of civilization that, for example, looks a little bit like what Norbert Elias writes about in Europe. I would say Norbert Elias has a great deal to teach to historians of India, and I certainly benefited a great deal from Norbert Elias' insights in what he calls the process of civilization. So in South Asia, the Timurid culture of chivalry was already quite advanced and urban and sophisticated and refined in many ways, in the sense that Elias also talks about it. But it was not just Timurid, it also accommodated the chivalry of particularly the Persians. And not only the Persians, but also, in a way, the Indo-Afghans that had preceded Babur as the great empire builders in Hindustan of the 15th century, and even had a comeback after Babur. But the Indo-Afghan codes of horse warrior codes of chivalry were also important in South Asia. And even more important, I would say, the Indian Rajputs. The Indian Rajputs are a chivalrous culture par excellence. This is not only the opinion of James Todd, who was the first to write about the Rajputs in English, who wrote a major work on it, the Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. He uses the word chivalry all the time. He thinks the Indian Rajputs are the most chivalrous culture, perhaps in the world, because it has the oldest dynasties, at least so some Indian Rajputs think. I'll come back to that in a moment. My point here is that the chivalry of the Mughal Empire is of a composite kind. It not only transcends the Hindu-Muslim divide, but it was contributed to by various sociocultural ethnic groups. It's nice. It's a nice and interesting category to use because it transcends the Hindu-Muslim divide, which is, I think, quite important. The Mughal Empire itself transcended this divide, and there's always the danger in India that everything is seen through this opposition of Hinduism and Muslim culture. But in the culture of chivalry, you don't have that problem because it accommodates Muslim and Hindu cultures quite nicely, and it points out some commonalities between them that are actually fundamental in the operation of this empire, one of the most important empires, of course, in the early modern world. Now, the Arabs do not contribute a great deal to this culture of chivalry of the Mughals, although the Arabs in earlier times, yes, of course, in Andalusia, in Spain, they did contribute a great deal to the chivalric culture of Europe. But in South Asia, in the Mughal Empire, it was particularly the Persians who were able to foster the more refined aspects of Mughal chivalry. And who are the Persians? Well, the Persians are people who came from Safavid Persia, an empire that had a special relationship with Mughal India, you might say. Ethnically, the Persians might be the same, actually, as the Mughals. Many Persians had Turco-Mongol origins. But they were, over the course of centuries, they were becoming part of a Persian culture in a different way. And this Persian culture had a very great cultural prestige in Mughal India, of course. Why? Well, part of the reason is that the chivalry of the Persians had the oldest roots. I think that's an important factor here. Persia, after all, had some of the most ancient empires. It produced some of the most ancient empires of the world. Older, in my opinion, than India. This is an opinion that's not always popular in India, but I do believe that this is, I will explain in a moment. The ancient Indian empires were not really empires in the sense that the Persian Empire was an empire, or for that matter, the Romans. Yes, there was, of course, Ashoka, and there was a Gupta Empire. But in my view, these were not really empires in the sense that we usually use the word. They were more like a ritual form of sovereignty. I have tried to defend the idea that the earliest empires in India were basically early medieval. The Gurjara Pratiharas are an example. These are early Rajput empires, or the Cholas, or the Palas, or even Kashmir had an empire. The Rashtrakutas are an example. In my view, these are the earliest real empires in India, not Ashoka. Ashoka, in my view, was a religious revolutionary in a way, but he did not unite the Indian subcontinent. I have never seen any evidence of that, even though there are a lot of people in India who want to believe that, and it has been an idea that was around for a long time. I think this should be abandoned. And same as the Guptas, it was very much a ritual sovereignty. But in Persia, you had a real empire, for better or worse. It's not necessarily a nice empire, but it had a kind of chivalry already in the centuries BC, a very long time before India. If you read Tomé Pires, the Portuguese writer of the 16th century, early 16th century, who wrote the Summa Oriental, he mentions this as well, that the Persians had a special cultural, let's say, reputation because they come from a country that had the earliest empires in the world, Nebuchadnezzar and Alexander the Great and so on, the Babylonians and so forth. And he doesn't mention ancient India. He mentions ancient Persia. And this is a source of a chivalry culture that becomes extremely important in the 16th and 17th and even in the 18th centuries in South Asia. This is, I think, an important factor that has to be, or an important fact that has to be considered in the study of chivalry. The content of this cultural code, well, of course, has changed all the time, but you can read an example in my fourth volume of Al-Hind. I have translated a Persian document there, which is a farman by King Tahmash Safavi to the governor of Herat, where he tries to give instructions to this governor how to deal with the fugitive Emperor Humayun from India and how he has to be treated with the utmost courtesy and politeness, in other words. This is several page, well, 20-page long document where I think the details of the code of chivalry are on full display. You can read it on pages 203 and 4 of my fourth volume. It goes in great detail about the kind of dishes that have to be prepared, the kind of perfumes that have to be used, how many people have to receive him, how that they should not speak too loud, and that the emperor should always be treated with extreme courtesy. And this is a kind of a document that is only there, I put in there to illustrate what chivalry means. Yeah, so the Persians, in my view, are the key to Mughal chivalry in its more refined manifestations, not the Indo-Afghans. The Indo-Afghans were important politically, but they were always seen and remained in the eyes of the Mughals, not really Mughals. They're not really Mughals. They're a kind of rival element, although they are a part of the nobility. Not in the beginning, but later on do become an important part again. And they have a certain culture of chivalry, which is more a tribal one, uniquely Afghan in many ways. So this is also something I try to describe. And even though they're Muslims, they are not really essential in Mughal culture. They've always been distrusted as rivals, and for good reason. After all, the 18th century, there's a major comeback of the Afghans that is very detrimental to the integrity of the Mughal Empire. So I do describe, however, the Indian Rajputs, especially the Rana of Mewar, as a key element in the Mughal culture of chivalry. The Mughals were quite clear about that. They considered the major dynasties of the Rajput as ancient and clearly of a noble origin, even though they are, religiously speaking, very different. They remain Hindus. And yet they contribute abundantly to the culture of chivalry in the 16th and 17th centuries. There's a whole new literature about this, that largely in the form of articles about the way that the Indian aristocracy of the Rajputs were integrated in the Mughal Empire. And this literature is also very detailed and interesting. I won't go into it much here, but I've used it. The main thing that I would like to highlight is that it agrees with James Todd, the Scottish writer, who in the early 19th century wrote the famous work, still the most important work on the Rajput annals and antiquities of Rajasthan. They're all in agreement that this integration of the Rajputs took a long time, quite a long time, until Jahangir, in fact, but that it was very successful. and that became a foundation of the Mughal Empire. The formal submission of Mewar, which is of course the most important royal house in Rajasthan, did not occur until Jahangir, in other words, the 17th century. And the House of Mewar never accepted to intermarry with the Turk, as they say, or the Tatar. That was considered too far beneath them. This was a part of the Rajput chivalric code that they considered themselves more noble, in fact, than the Tatars, and they were in fact an older dynasty than the Mughal dynasty itself. Right, you look at the record of the Rajputs of Rajasthan, or what was called Rajvara in the time. You can find a very interesting Rajput chivalric culture, but it doesn't have ancient Indian roots again. This is very striking. No Rajput source refers to Ashoka or the Guptas or another ancient Indian empire. Indeed, they refer to early medieval roots that are Persian or even Byzantine. Yeah, that is something that James Todd has also brought out. James Todd was a bit of a romantic, perhaps, or in any case, he was Scottish, and he tended to like this culture of chivalry very much. He speaks even of the romantic chivalry of the Rajputs, which he says is unsurpassed in the annals of the West. So he thinks of these Rajputs as quite heroic and dignified, and that honor is the central element in this chivalric culture. But these Rajput chiefs don't claim roots in ancient times. They sometimes can be traced to the Central Asian Shakas, in other words, Scythian origins, Shakas. But the House of Mewar claims that it had Persian, Sassanid, and Byzantine roots in the 6th century AD, not Indian. But this is a very important thing to keep in mind, that the origins of Indian chivalry are in fact in many ways early medieval, and before that we don't really know much about it. It had something to do with the weak development of imperial power structures prior to early medieval times. Okay, whether you believe that or not, I don't know, but I certainly believe it. And I've tried to show why this is the case. My point here is that the culture of chivalry in Mughal India is a composite one. It consists of Timurid Mughal elements, Persian elements, African elements, and very much Indian elements as well. It was, in other words, not homogeneous. The ethnic constituents in the horse-riding warrior elite of the Empire of the Great Mughals always remained somewhat distinct. You can see boundaries fairly easily between Rajputs and Afghans and Persians and so on, and also Turks. Intermarriage occurred, of course, on the highest levels, but nonetheless there were ethnic components that always remained, to some extent, distinct. And yet, I would claim there is a single culture of chivalry that was shared across ethnic lines and across religious boundaries. That is the central idea here. In other words, there is a kind of aristocratic culture shared by the horse-riding warrior elites of the time, and even shared by people below that to some extent. That is, as I said, even though there are many different ethnic components in the Mughal Empire, there's a shared culture of chivalry. And I've distinguished four characteristics of this shared culture of chivalry that more or less permeated all the noble ranks in the Mughal Empire, and to some extent it was also adopted by lower, quote unquote, ranks in society. But let me explain very briefly what these four are. One was that there was among these elites a disdain for the petty details of administration and small numbers. In fact, for many matters of practicality. And the result is that there are very poor statistics. I've yet to meet anyone who can make sense of the statistics in the Akbarnama. They are rather a mess, in other words. It's very difficult to get a statistical, precise account of, well, the income, the revenue, the tribute system, and so on of the Mughal Empire. This level was delegated to Hindu scribal caste and financiers, bookkeepers, but the chivalrous elite could not really be bothered too much with it. They were very interested in the artificial formality of the honor code, I might say. They were extremely precise with matters of honor. We would say morbidly so in the eyes of modern people, in the eyes of our times. The chivalric code of Mughal India was characterized by an extremely artificial formality, the petty details of which were taken very serious. All the what we call petty details were not petty details in the code of chivalry. They were in fact regulated with mathematical precision. For example, precedence, who went first, how long people were allowed to talk, where they were allowed to stand, how close to the emperor they could stand. Gift giving, also another thing that was regulated with mathematical precision. So the honor code of this chivalric society was extremely highly developed, much higher than what we have today. But the practical details of administration were left to a scribal caste and financiers and so on that were not part of this noble society. That is the first thing I would like to point out. The disdain for petty details of administration, even disdain for literacy sometimes, that you find that indeed among the Rajputs sometimes. Disdain for literacy, disdain for statistics, but extreme interest, extreme emphasis on the honor code and the artificial formality of ranks. That's one. The second thing that I think permeates the code of chivalry in Mughal India from one end to the other is that there was a distinctive noble lifestyle cultivated and mode of behavior. This includes all the elements of, for example, great wealth. That was very striking in India in particular. The nobility was extremely wealthy, not to mention the imperial family, much more so than in Europe. The luxury of the courts was also always mentioned by foreign observers, far exceeded that of any other country, with the possible exception of China. So the code of behavior that is typical of all nobilities was, I would say, also found in Mughal India with a vengeance. I described the contents of that code of behavior to some extent, but this again deserves an entire volume. You could write a whole book about that, and I haven't, but I have mentioned it and I emphasize it. And this noble lifestyle and mode of comportment, what people eat, what people wear, how people speak, and so on, all that is extremely significant in the code of chivalry of Mughal India. And the third element of chivalry around the world and also in Mughal India is that it regulated gender relations by investing honor in women in certain prescribed ways. This is also very important in Mughal India. Here we can look, for example, at something like purdah, which is extremely important among both the Hindu and Muslim nobilities. Recently, I read something about 18th century Gujarat, the gracia, predatory gracias. A text that I found on this, these are considered savage people by all observers. Even they have purdah. Purdah was a very significant element in the code of chivalry, even in the lower levels of society. Among the aristocracies in India, we find polygamy as an element of the code of chivalry. What I find particularly striking is taboos on widow remarriage. Well, we all know about the widow immolation in among Rajputs in particular, but in fact among all higher castes in India, what is called sati, the practice of sati, in other words, widow immolation. This is in fact part of the code of chivalry. And Puas, or Portuguese author, he in fact says that it is part of the chivalry of the Hindus, not the Muslims, but there were taboos on widow remarriage even among Muslims. But the most striking taboo on widow remarriage is, of course, among the Hindus. So gender relations are meticulously regulated in certain ways because honor is invested in particular in women. Now, the fourth element that I think is found across the culture of chivalry in Mughal India is that chivalry was always linked to the world of privilege, the world of institutionalized dissidence, I might call it. Privilege really means private law. And the idea that you can have an aristocracy without privilege is inconceivable, because this is where honor was based. Private law, the code of honor, and privilege are characteristics that are found in the culture of chivalry. This, of course, means that the chronicles, and we have a lot of chronicles in Mughal India, these are usually about clashes between kings and rebellious nobles and endless quarrels about precedents and so on, about honor. This is always the case when you read these chronicles. They are full of what you might call rebellions or clashes. And this is what I think is a central aspect of the culture of chivalry that we find in 16th, 17th, 18th century India as well, and continues to find, that we continue to find there until the 19th century. So these four elements that I just elaborated are shared by the entire Mughal elite. Whether they're Hindus or not doesn't matter, or whether they're Muslim doesn't matter. And this is what I found interesting. When you go to Java, which I consider to be part of India, in the 17th century and 16th century at least, the East Indies or East India, whatever you want to call it, there too you find an Indo-Islamic state you might even call it an empire, which we call Mataram or New Mataram, and which originated in the 16th century, and which was also a horse warrior empire, not a gunpowder empire, and which therefore retained a chivalrous culture and society, even I would say into the 19th century. In Java, it was perhaps developed even further in some respects than in Mughal India. We have, for example, two different languages, an elite language and a language for commoners in Old Javanese that are mutually not comprehensible. These are not just different dialects or different vocabularies, but they are actually different languages for the elite and the commoners. And there are many other elements of chivalry in Java, in Mataram, Central Java in particular, the courts of Yogyakarta and Surakarta, that are very strikingly a culture of chivalry, and these are, of course, described in great detail in the Japanese chronicles and also in Dutch sources of the early modern period. The extreme elaboration of a code of honor, and again, all the 4 points that I mentioned that were important in Mughal India, I also found there, sometimes in even more detailed and extreme or more extreme forms than in South Asia. Okay, well, that is. I was under the impression that I shouldn't talk too long, not longer than 45 minutes. This is why I think I should stop here. As I said, there should be a lot more work done on chivalry in South Asia. It could be an extremely interesting book for anyone who has the inclination to study it. Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Professor Wink, for that truly extraordinary lecture. Your reflections on the culture of chivalry have gave us not only a rich historical journey across continents and centuries, but also a profound meditation on the ideas of honor, loyalty, and material ethics that shaped so many societies. You have reminded us that shape chivalry was never merely a code of the battlefield. It was also a cultural language through which power, community, and imagination are expressed. In tracing these traditions, you have shown us that chivalry was both universal and particular, while rooted in specific times and places. It traveled across frontiers, resonating in the worlds of the knight, the sultan, and the empire alike. What emerged from your lecture is a recognition that chivalric culture was not just a matter of military conduct, but a moral and symbolic framework, and that bound rulers and subjects, warrior and poets, law and custom into a shared imagination of honor. For all of us gathered here, your lecture has been far more than an exploration of the past. It has been an invitation to reflect on how ideals continue to shape history, how values travel across borders, and how memory carries forward the aspiration of entire civilization. You have compelled us to see that the culture of chivalry was not an ornament of history, but one of its engines, animating politics, literature, and social life with remarkable depth and endurance. With this reflection in mind, let us now open the floor for questions and dialogue so that we may continue to learn from you, Professor Wink, and engage further with the breadth and brilliance of your scholarship. So, Professor, with your permission, can I proceed to our question answer session?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Okay, so questions are from our YouTube. Actually, this was live, and The first question is from my friend Ayush. He is asking that Professor Wink, your lecture highlighted the trans-regional and cross-cultural nature of chivalric ideas. Yet, given that chivalry is a concept rooted in a very specific medieval European milieu, how do we avoid the danger of projecting a Eurocentric category onto non-European societies? To what extent can we legitimately speak of a universal culture of chivalry, and when does such a framework risk flattening diverse traditions of martial ethics into a single narrative?
Yeah, there's always the danger that when you use a term like chivalry, that people will accuse you of being Eurocentric because, but after all, we are speaking English today, and therefore it's, I think, justified to use the English word for something that is found, in fact, in all cultures, all in many cultures, under different names. As I said, the Portuguese, when they come to South Asia, they use the word cavallerosa. And I would be happy to say that we should perhaps also use the word cavallerosa, but then nobody would understand it. And well, one thing that the future writer of a book on chivalry, who I hope will arise, should be able to study the terminologies that are current in Indian languages or Persian to denote similar things that we have identified, for example, in European chivalry. You can also call it an aristocratic culture, but it is a kind of aristocracy that has essentially developed as a horse warrior aristocracy. I don't think that we can talk about, for example, chivalry in ancient Greece in this way. We cannot talk about chivalry everywhere. It has to be a horse warrior aristocracy's culture. Modern countries don't have that kind of aristocracies. So it's a specific kind of society. And I'm not saying that chivalry is a European thing at all. In fact, I think nobody has ever thought that. Not even George Duby, who has this book on, it's called The Chivalrous Society. The original title was in French, La Société Chevaleresque. So it simply means a horse, cheval, cavalry. When you have a cavalry aristocracy, you can have a culture of chivalry with all the poetry and with all the refinement and also with all the crudeness. Because these horse warrior cultures were not necessarily very nice in all respects. And the treatment of widows, for example, you might say is not a nice element of chivalry at all. There is nasty chivalry and nice chivalry. It's poetic in many ways. The language of Indian chivalry is very poetic. Persian poetry plays a big role in it. For this reason, somebody who studies chivalry in South Asia should be very sensitive to the language, particularly Persian in Mughal India, chivalric language above all. So the whole idea is to elaborate in more detail what this aristocratic culture really was all about. In its fundamentals, it is not unlike chivalrous cultures elsewhere, but it has its own features that are not found anywhere else. You have to think about Norbert Elias, for example, or Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, about distinction, this kind of thing, and Thorstein Veblen, the American sociologist who wrote about the theory of the leisure class and who invented terms like conspicuous consumption, conspicuous leisure, conspicuous everything. It's kind of a theater, this aristocracy, but it's also serious. And theater is, after all, also very serious. People sometimes think that, oh, it's just theater. It's not serious, but theater is very serious. So there's like a display of all kinds of things, and at the same time the military culture, and sometimes even a militaristic culture. So I want to get away from this idea that it is only about politeness and courtesy and formality. No, it's not only that. It's also that, but it has its fundamental. It is fundamentally a military institution. But the funny thing is that it is also on the highest, most refined levels of communication and expression. It's also the same culture of chivalry. That's why I think it has a great potential. It has also there's a lot of material on it. If you know enough Indian sources, you can really find enormous interesting stuff on this. The culture of horses alone is a very rich subject. How horses are, an element of chivalry itself. The love of horses, very well known from Europe as well. But in Europe, you get a kind of modern development in the 16th century, which is not very nice, namely centralized early modern states based on infantry and guns. Pretty horrible, in fact. And chivalry is gradually lost in Europe. You know, of course, Don Quixote, that is the last really interesting manifestation of chivalry written by Cervantes in Spain in the early 17th century. And Don Quixote is a mad proponent of chivalry when it is disappearing. So I think it survives in India very long. And this is one reason why people in India are still a bit more formal than in Europe, I might say. They are. And they're certainly more formal than Americans, where there's never been chivalry. Cowboys and Indians are not chivalry. That's very different. So the Indians, I think, are more formal because they have been the chivalrous culture longer than Europe or America. Whether you like it or not, I mean, that's another matter. I don't say I like it or dislike. That's not the issue at all. Mongol chivalry was not especially likable, believe me. But later on in the 17th century, all the rough edges of that Mongol culture had gone, like the Towers of Skulls, for example. That is no longer found in India in the 17th century, except the Uzbeks in the beginning of the 17th century still built some. But it was an element of Mongol culture in the medieval times, but this is sort of phased out, and you get a more refined Turco-Mongol culture, Timurid culture. That development is a fascinating development, how you get from Mongols to Mughals. And I think that could be worked on much more. I hope I answered the question. I'm not even sure.
Thank you so much, sir. Next question is from Rakhi. The question is, historians often romanticize chivalry as a code of honor and loyalty. But at its heart, was not chivalry also an ideology that legitimized violence, conquest, and exclusion, especially against subaltern groups, women, and religious others? How do we reconcile the celebrated ethics of chivalry with its simultaneous role in reproducing hierarchies of class, gender, and faith?
Yeah, this is correct. There's a lot of antagonism within elites, and you can see even in the Mughal dynasty itself, you have a ferocious interdynastic war that are tied into the conquest history of Mughal India. The most important or most famous of these internal conflicts in the Mughal dynasty was, of course, the succession struggle that brought Aurangzeb on the throne. Yeah, this is famous. It was famous in the time that it occurred. Even in Europe, people heard about this. And this fratricidal element in succession struggle in Mughal India which has also links to the conquest history. This shows you that chivalry is not all about politeness and courtesy, not at all. But if you say, "Oh, this is very chivalrous," this is so chivalrous of you. This is supposed to be a compliment that you're being polite. But my point is that yes, this is also part of the culture of chivalry, flattery, for example, politeness, flattery, but also conflict, and indeed institutionalized conflict between various elements of the aristocracy and the royalty. There was always dissidence within the kingdom that expressed itself as rebellion. There's one rebellion after the other. That's typical of chivalrous society, because the privileges of the aristocracy are such that they have a certain independence. They are not just servants in the bureaucracy. They have an independent honor and privilege. That is part of the chivalric code. If people become just servants, then you are talking about a modern bureaucracy. That's very different. So I find this chivalrous society extremely interesting, but it can mean many things. And it doesn't exist anymore, except there are, of course, survivals in our modes of address and so on. And there are always all these distinctions. So I hope I answered that question too. I'm not sure.
Thank you so much, Professor. The next question is from Shubhadeep. He is asking, the archive of chivalry, whether in Europe, the Islamic world, or South Asia, largely reflect elite voices, chronicles, courtly literature, epics. But what of the silences? How might the subaltern, the defeated, or the marginalized have perceived these chivalric ideals imposed upon them? Is there space in your framework to recover these suppressed perspectives, or must the study of chivalry necessarily remain bound to elite historiography?
I didn't understand the question. Sorry. Can you rephrase it shortly?
Okay, can I
I didn't
can
understand.
I am reading this again, Professor. The
Yeah,
question is
can you repeat it slowly?
okay, sorry, sir. The archive of chivalry, whether in Europe, the Islamic world, or South Asia, largely reflects elite voices, chronicles, courtly literature, epics,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah.
But what of the silences? How might the
Yeah,
subaltern, the defeated, or the marginalized have perceived these chivalric ideals imposed upon them? Is there space in your framework to recover these suppressed perspectives, or must the study of chivalry necessarily remain bound to elite historiography?
yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Um, you're saying that this comes from elite records, yes. Unfortunately, this is sometimes all we have. But it is one of the things that I find very striking, which is that some of these aristocratic ideals percolate down to the other levels of society. And many people have observed that. For example, in Java, politeness is a virtue in itself, politeness and flattery, to a fault sometimes. And even Karl Marx said this about India, that even the most simple peasant are more polite than Italians. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but many people have observed there is a certain passion for polite behavior. And I try to quote that sometimes. I'm not suggesting there's no discord between the people without voice, usually the peasantry, and the so-called elites. There is, of course, a great deal of discord and oppression and violence, all built in any imperial system. But there's also a certain shared chivalry, even with the non-nobility. What I was reading a few days ago, a big work by James Forbes of the 18th century called Oriental Memoirs, and there he describes how the bandits of the Gracias in Gujarat, who are notorious, like the Kolis and the Bhils and the Gracias, that they are also adopting purdah in their mud fortresses. They're adopting certain elements of elite culture, even among the bandits of the forest, he says. Well, that's what I say, but that's what you read there. But you can argue that there's even among the most oppressed and irregular, downtrodden groups, on the tribal fringes, that elements of this culture are percolating. But one of the problems with India is, of course, that yes, all the chronicles are written by, to some extent, elite people. That doesn't mean that they don't look at other levels, but if you want to read about peasants, you often learn more from a few European writers who may not be of the elite themselves. In fact, this is one reason they look at it more. Or Maratha sources. The people without voice, it's very hard to reconstruct because they have no voice, but you can still say a lot of things about it. I find, for example, the rise of the Marathas is a good example of how a peasant culture becomes sort of post-late Mughal culture and adopts many things, but also doesn't adopt everything. Sort of Mughal peasants are rising in the 18th century. Kumbis who become Rajputs. And so, these were the marginal people before, and then they become people at the very center. You can say the same thing about the Mongols. They were extremely marginal. The Eurasian steppe nomads were at the margin of civilization for centuries. These steppe nomads were not considered civilized people. They had no voice either. They didn't write. The Turks and the Mongols, and for a very long time, were thoroughly rejected and had no voice until they conquered these areas and founded some of the most wealthy empires, the history of the universe. For example, the Manchus in China in 17th century, and the Mughals are an example of people with an obscure origin who became wealthier than any other early modern empire, far more than the French. They were for a very obscure background in the beginning, but 5 centuries later, they are building the Taj Mahal and they're building, the Red Fort and edifices in Asia. But these are all people who came out of nowhere almost, from the point of view of settled civilizations. And to some extent, the Rajputs of India too, they have obscure origins, and they become extremely powerful by the 17th century. These cities these fortresses of the Rajput are almost as monumental as the Mughal architecture. So these are all people who started as people without voices and in the periphery of something else. And this is what I found interesting also, the development of these aristocratic formations, with the codes of chivalry, from very basic, simple roots. Yes.
Okay, so the next question is from Akash. He is asking, your comparative method brings into conversation knights, sultans, and emperors across geographies. But comparison can sometimes obscure asymmetries of power. For example, where chivalric ideals truly shared across cultures, or were they shaped and distorted through the unequal encounters of war, crusade, and empire? How do you guard against comparison becoming a homogeneous gesture rather than a recognition of difference and conflict?
Right. Yes, this is also a good point. I would like to emphasize again that, in my opinion, contestation is one of the keys of chivalry. You don't have a centralized, homogenized, modern state. Contestation, dissidence, is really a constituent of a culture of chivalry. Largely also because people have independent positions and are recognized as people with their own honor and privilege, private law. So there's no question of homogeneity at all. That's why the chivalric societies are actually quite complicated. No standardization. So this is a very good point. I would say this is why I want to emphasize that chivalry is not only about politeness and poetry and courtesy. No, it is a culture of dissidence and also military. That is one reason I wanted to present this paper. It's a military culture of independent nobles and all many levels of hierarchy that are constantly shifting and contested in many ways, openly or not openly. That is what is going on in the chronicles of Mughal India and also the 18th century. These contestations are sometimes a bit repetitive, but if you know how to deal with it, it can become interesting. Not all the Mughal historians really read those chronicles. They prefer to read a summary. This is true, but that's because they're so big. I mean, they're like. But if you read carefully the details, you can reconstruct this culture in interesting ways. That doesn't have to be repetitive. So you can also, again, refer to Norbert Elias, the process of civilization, and see how that can be done. I think he's kind of a good example of how you can make that work. Or Pierre Bourdieu is another example. He speaks about the eating habits of the French bourgeoisie in 600 pages. Well, in India, these cultural distinctions are also extremely elaborate and interesting. Different kinds of rice and eating and music, language, whatever. All these things are there, but they have not been systematically studied from this point of view. But contestation is at the heart of chivalry. Also between genders. I'm not suggesting that women are treated well in the chivalric society that I was looking at, but they are treated in specific ways, and honor is invested in it by men and women. Whether this is nice, I don't mean to suggest it is always nice. Hardly anyone today can condone the practice of widow immolation, okay? I don't think anyone in this group would condone that today. But it was a practice, a part of the chivalric code, not a nice one. But this is another example of nasty chivalry, perhaps. The interesting part might also be the poetry of it, the poetic language that has to be dug up. This is sort of the means of communication in a chivalric culture. Poetry is very important. And you shouldn't dismiss it as an irrelevant ornament. So this is all why I think that the concept is a useful one. It gets you away from the endless debates about Hindus and Muslims. You don't want to talk only about Hindus and Muslims and communalism. You have a culture here that is shared, even though there are particulars for different constituents in it. I hope to see somebody write a book about it the next couple of years.
Okay, so next question is from Piali. She is asking, if we think of chivalry not as a medieval relic, but as a cultural imagination, how do we trace its afterlives into modernity? Do you see echoes of chivalric ideals in colonial military cultures, nationalistic discourse, or even in contemporary notions of masculinity and honor? And if
Oh,
so, does the persist? Yeah, sir.
I
And
would say
if
yes.
so, does the persistence of chivalry expose a continuity of domination disguised as virtue?
Yeah, I find, I hope you don't take offense from this, but class conscience today is very strong still. Class consciousness in England and India is very strong. Nobody will deny that. And that certain types of behavior are associated with that, that are basically continuations of the earlier chivalric code, very much so. As I said already, the modes of address in Indian society I find more formal than in American society. I lived in both countries for many years, and whether you like it or not is another matter, but the Indian formality is still like a throwback to the chivalric society that it comes out of. In America, you never had that. America broke away from that. People call you by your first name the first minute you meet. Again, whether you like that or not is not the issue. Some people don't like that. They prefer to create more distance. But you can't escape it when you go to the United States. You have no titles. People hate titles. Even in academia, titles are not used. In Europe, more so. And in India, even more, I think. Indians are more polite people than we are. I'm a European, born in India, in Indonesia. So I try to sort of look at this in a historical way, and there are many things that are still around in the behavior of contemporary people that are basically referring back to the aristocratic culture of the 17th and 16th centuries and before. Yes, and gender relations also. Yes. I don't want to go into the details, but I would say this is also an interesting for the epilogue of that book on chivalry that I hope will be written soon. What is now still around in the modern society. Modern societies are different from chivalric societies in many ways. They're also much more boring, I think.
Okay, the next question is from Shanton. He's asking, is chivalry a moral substance or a political technology? In other words, should we understand chivalry as an intrinsic ethical formation or as a deliberate technique for producing particular kinds of subjects, soldiers, nobles, rulers, whose dispositions legitimize hierarchical power? If the latter, what does that imply about the possibility of judging chivalric actions by universal moral standards?
Yes, this is a good question. And I'm not sure if I know the answer. But again, if you look at what the Americans have done, they have rejected this. If you are an Englishman and you come from a chivalric culture, you have to sort of abandon your titles if you want to become an American. So they swept away this whole thing. Like Mao did the same. Modern codes of behavior often very hostile to this. The whole idea that some people are basically dominating entire societies and think that that is justified religiously and also morally, that can be offensive to people today. Not to everybody, but yes, in modern times this has come under fire, of course, in Russia in particular. But in India too, I would say there's an enormous amount of rejection of this heritage, what I call an imperial heritage of an aristocratic culture. As I said, you don't have to like it. It's quite legitimate to reject that. You may say that it is an unjust society, yeah. I have never lived in a just society yet. Unfortunately, I would like to, but I'm not sure what that really means. But if you want to reject the aristocratic culture of the Middle Ages, be my guest. I don't think historians are in the business of approving or rejecting religions or societies, but rather making them understandable in the terms of the people that were in it. But I can totally understand that people find these class differences repugnant, just as you may reject caste, which is also to some extent bound up with this. And by studying it, you don't justify it. You just try to explain the mechanics of power and culture, and how culture and power are sort of rolled into one society. That's interesting, but not necessarily uplifting. So moral, I don't know the moral. Certainly, for example, the Rajputs would fight thinking that they represent upon a particular Hindu deity. In that sense, they would believe that they are moral, but that doesn't mean that you and I believe that too. We cannot live in a chivalrous society. We would find it very difficult to take all those things serious to the degree that people at that time did. If you read Jahangir's memoirs, there are all these gifts flying around, and he specifies exactly how much it is worth, to the penny. So many rupees and annas, this gift. The precision with which that is done strikes us as utterly ridiculous and repugnant. But this is what the code of honor was about. So I was trying to suggest that it's not always nice, chivalry. And it's conflict-ridden, completely.
Although we have more, a lot question, but the time is actually
Yeah,
so, okay.
It's 5:30 already. Yeah.
We take our, one more question, and this is our last question. The question is from Srijoni. She is asking, is the afterlife of chivalry a form of political nostalgia that sustains inequity by aesthetizing past authority?
Yeah, I believe that is often the case among certain descendants of the aristocracy. They just don't want to become modern people with equality written on their face. Yes, nostalgia for this pre-modern or early modern world is very, very common. In Europe also. Even in America, if you look at the number of people that watch Downton Abbey, the Americans are crazy about these things. And they're nostalgic. And I think in India too, you have this very strong, you may call that nostalgia or whatever you want, a reactionary nostalgia. People sometimes hate many aspects of modern life, and they think that this order had interesting dimensions that have been lost, unfortunately. Yes, I can easily imagine that. That doesn't mean that the study of 16th and 17th century cultures are motivated by nostalgia among historians. Historians study anything. They can study anything. And sometimes they study things they don't like at all. I find it personally very interesting, but I also find other societies interesting. But nostalgia is certainly very widespread in our era. And it will become more so, perhaps, when modernity and capitalism have more or less become dominant everywhere. And they're becoming more and more dominant everywhere. Even in my lifetime, it has changed so dramatically. Yes, I find myself nostalgic sometimes also. But modernity is something you cannot imagine away. It is something that is very difficult to do without. And it goes on and on. I don't know. This is something that you have to figure out. What do you do with your nostalgia or the lack thereof?
Okay, Professor. So
Yeah.
before we bring this gathering to a close, I feel a profound sense of responsibility, born of admiration and gratitude, to say a few words to you, Professor Wink. Listening to you this evening has been nothing short of a journey across worlds, where history, culture, and imagination intertwine. In your lecture on chivalry, you did not merely recount traditions of honor and loyalty. You revealed how these ideals traveled across borders and epochs, shaping empires, literature, diplomacy, and everyday life. Through your words, chivalry became more than a code of conduct. It emerged as a cultural language of power, memory, and aspiration. What you offered us tonight was far more than a historical analysis. You allowed us to glimpse the moral imagination of societies past, to see how notions of honor and duty carried weight not just on the battlefield but in the very fabric of community and kingship. You reminded us that ideals are not abstract. They live in people's choices, in their struggles, and in the legacies they leave behind. Your lecture compels us to think of history not as something distant, but as something alive, still echoing in the values and conflicts of our own world. And in doing so, you have given us both knowledge and responsibility to read the past with care and to recognize in it the enduring questions of what it means to live with honor, justice, and humanity. Professor Wink, we are deeply humbled by the generosity of your presence and by the brilliance with which you have shared your insights. We leave this gathering with a renewed sense of wonder that history, when guided by scholarship of your depth, is not only a record of what was, but also a meditation on what still matters. With folded hands and the deepest reverence, we thank you so much, Professor.
Well, thank you too. I'm on my part also very honored to be able to speak, even though it is on Zoom. I find it an honor.
Thank
Thank you too.